I've never done this before.
I know, it's okay.
I've never been kissed. It slipped out, right there in the doorway. To the most dangerous man in New York. He didn't laugh, didn't pull back. He stepped closer slowly and said, "Then let's start slow," and pulled me in. I was 22 and thought my life was boring. I didn't know that kiss was just the beginning, and that the world that came after it would destroy me before rebuilding me into something I never imagined I could be. Let me tell you something. If he looked at you and said your name, would you have the courage to answer? Chapter 1. The man who ordered black coffee and...
Why does he stay?
I've been working at the same coffee shop for 2 years, and I know each customer by their order before they even open their mouths. The 9 o'clock lady wants a cappuccino with almond milk and 2 spoons of brown sugar. The 7:30 executive orders a double espresso without looking at me, and the girl who studies design like me always picks the latte with that foam I draw a crooked heart on top of. That's why, when he walked in at 9:17 on a Thursday morning, I immediately knew he was different. I'd never seen that man before, and I would have remembered if I had, because there was something about him that filled the space in a way that made other people seem smaller without him having to do absolutely anything. The coffee shop was in that quiet pause between the morning rush and the lazy lunch hour, and the sound of the light rain tapping on the window created that cozy atmosphere that made me forget Brooklyn could be chaotic. He wore a dark suit, no tie, with the first 2 buttons of his shirt undone, and there was something about the way he moved that made me stop cleaning the espresso machine that was already clean. His eyes swept the entire place before sweeping the menu above my shoulder, as if he needed to map every exit, every person, every detail before deciding he was safe enough to order a coffee. I tried not to think too much about it and focused on looking professional, but I felt that gaze like it was something physical. That's when I noticed the 2 men outside, standing in the rain like statues. No umbrella, no complaints, not even seeming bothered by the water running down their dark suits. That was weird, really weird. But I was in Brooklyn, and I'd seen weird things before, so I filed the observation away and turned my attention back to the man who was now in front of me. "Coffee, no sugar." His voice was deep, controlled, and came out effortlessly. I blinked, waiting for the rest of the order, because nobody orders just coffee. Everyone wants something extra. "That's it?" The question came out before I could filter it, and he looked at me in a way that made my stomach tie into a small, tight knot, as if the question was more interesting than the answer itself. For now, those 2 words hung in the air between us, loaded with something I couldn't name but felt at the back of my neck, at my fingertips, in the way my breathing got a little shallower. I nodded and turned to make the coffee, feeling his eyes on me the whole time, and my hands trembled slightly when I grabbed the cup. When I placed the coffee in front of him, our fingers almost touched, and I pulled my hand away too fast, as if the contact could burn. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't show it, just picked up the cup and went to the corner table, the one near the window, and sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. He stayed for 90 minutes. 90. I know because I kept looking at the wall clock more times than I should have, trying to understand what a man like him was doing in a small Brooklyn coffee shop when he clearly belonged somewhere else. He read documents, pages and pages he pulled from a leather folder, and didn't touch his phone even once, which was so unusual that I actually checked if mine had signal. Every 15 minutes, he'd lift his eyes from the papers and look at me, and every time that happened, I'd pretend to be busy with something important, like reorganizing the napkins that were already perfectly organized, or cleaning the counter I'd already cleaned 3 times. But I felt that gaze stuck on me even when I turned away, as if he was studying every move I made. When he finally stood up to leave, he left $200 in tips on top of the white napkin. $200 for a coffee that cost $3.50. I stared at the bills like they'd disappear if I blinked, and when I looked up, he was already at the door, turning his face for a second to look at me one more time before disappearing into the rain with the 2 men who were waiting for him. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and took a picture of the bills, sending it straight to the group chat. The group had the ridiculous name Nyla Land because Adeline thought I needed my own kingdom, even if that kingdom was just an apartment shared with 2 friends and a routine that fit on a spreadsheet. The response came in less than 10 seconds. Theo changed the group name to Nyla Lad and sent in all caps, "Woman, who is this man?" Adeline was direct. "Google his face now." I replied, "Guys, he's just a customer." And Theo came back with, $200 in tips isn't just a customer, it's intention. I put the money in my pocket and tried to get back to normal work, but my head was somewhere else, on those dark eyes that had studied me like I was an interesting puzzle, on that deep voice that had said, "For now," like it was a promise. He came back on Friday. Same time, 9:17, as if he had an internal clock more precise than any alarm. Same order, black coffee, same corner table, Same documents, same total absence of hurry, and the same $200 left on the napkin when he left, always without saying more than necessary. On Saturday it was the same, and on Monday too, and on Tuesday I was already waiting for him without even realizing I was. Already had the cup halfway ready before he arrived. Already knew he'd stay exactly 90 minutes and leave with that absurd tip I didn't understand. But what I noticed most, what kept me up at night and occupied my mind when I should have been studying design, was the way he looked at me, always a second longer than necessary, always with that intensity that made my stomach flip and my face heat up without permission. He didn't smile, didn't make any sudden movements, just looked, and somehow that was more unsettling than anything else. On the fourth visit, the question came out of my mouth before my brain could veto it. He was in line, waiting his turn like always, and when he got to the front, the words just escaped. "Don't you have anything better to do?" The silence that followed was heavy and loaded. He looked at me, and for the first time, I thought I saw something that could be humor cross that controlled face, almost a smile forming at the corner of his mouth, before disappearing so fast I might have imagined it. I do. The pause was too long, and he held me in his gaze in a way that made my heart race, but I'd rather be here. I felt the floor become unsteady under my feet, and pretended I urgently needed to check something in the back, which was an obvious lie because I was in the middle of helping him. I practically ran to the bathroom and locked the door, leaning against it and breathing deeply, trying to understand why those 5 words had completely destroyed me. My face was red when I looked at myself in the mirror, and I knew he'd seen it, had noticed, and probably knew exactly the effect he'd caused. I splashed my face with cold water and tried to pull myself together before going back, but when I came out, he was already at his usual table, looking at me with all that attention that made me feel naked, even fully clothed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I knew, without even looking, that it was Theo. I checked quickly, and the message said exactly what I expected. She blushed. I can feel it from here. I hadn't even told them anything yet, but Theo had that disturbing 6th sense for these things. The rest of the shift passed in a strange fog where I was hyper-aware of his every movement, of every time he lifted his eyes from the documents to look at me, of every second those dark eyes stayed fixed on me before returning to work. It was like there was an invisible thread connecting me to him, and every time he pulled, I felt it on my skin. When he finally left, leaving the usual $200, I stood at the counter for too long, staring at the empty chair where he'd been, still feeling his presence in the air like it was something physical that didn't disappear just because he'd left. That night, he returned to the car where Dante was waiting for him, and his right-hand man glanced at the coffee shop before asking the question he'd probably been holding in for days. "Why are we spending mornings at a Brooklyn coffee shop?" Enrico didn't answer immediately, just looked out the window at the rain that had come back, at the city lights starting to turn on, at the world that kept spinning. Dante waited, because he'd known the boss long enough to know when to push and when to let silence do the work. But the answer didn't come. Enrico just kept looking out the window, with an expression Dante had never seen before on that always controlled, always calculated face. Something that looked dangerously close to real interest, to genuine curiosity, to a need that had nothing to do with business or power. Dante registered everything without saying a word, and when he started the car to leave, he cast one last look at the lit coffee shop, where a 22-year-old girl was cleaning the counter with no idea of the kind of attention she'd attracted. The kind of attention men like Enrico Rinaldi didn't give to anyone. The kind of attention that changed everything. And as he drove through the wet streets of Brooklyn, Dante thought he'd never seen the boss do this before. This kind of silent watch, this careful observation, this interest that was growing slowly, but was already impossible to ignore. He'd never seen Enrico Rinaldi spend 90 minutes in an artisanal coffee shop every day, just to look at someone who didn't even know his name. He'd never seen him do this before. And that, more than anything else, was the sign that something had changed. Something important. Something that would probably complicate everything in ways none of them could predict yet. Imagine if he sent you a message right now. What would you say to him? Chapter 2. Dinner with the Mafia boss.
This is insaner.
I've never been kissed 3 weeks after the first time he walked into the coffee shop. I already knew things about Enrico. I hadn't asked permission to know, but had collected anyway, piece by piece, like someone putting together a puzzle without having the complete picture on the box. I knew he liked coffee bitter enough to make other people wrinkle their noses just imagining it, that he hated unnecessary noise and got visibly tense when some customer talked too loud on the phone, and that he read contracts like they were novels, with that total attention most people reserve for things far more interesting than legal documents. And I also knew that he looked at me like I was a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve yet, like my existence had messed up some carefully drawn plan. And now he was trying to figure out how to fit me back in without breaking anything important. It was unsettling and fascinating at the same time, and I hated how much I liked all that attention. What I didn't know, and what bothered me more than it should, was his last name, where he came from, what he did for a living besides reading endless documents in Brooklyn coffee shops. I'd tried Googling Enrico New York dark suit once, and given up when I realized how ridiculous and desperate that was. He also knew things about me I didn't remember telling him, but that had somehow escaped during the short conversations we had between one coffee and another. He knew I worked 5 shifts a week, that I studied graphic design at night in online classes that left me red-eyed and headachy, and that I had 2 friends I mentioned all the time, because they were basically my entire family in New York. Once I genuinely laughed at something a customer had said, and when I looked at the corner, Enrico was watching me with that expression I still couldn't fully decipher, like he was recording that moment in some mental file he kept carefully. This should have scared me, but it didn't, and I didn't know what that said about me. The rain came back on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the first time he walked through the door, and this time it was heavy, violent, the kind that turned Brooklyn streets into shallow rivers, and made everyone run inside. My shift ended at 6 in the evening, and when I walked out the side door with my crappy umbrella that was already half broken, the first thing I saw was him. Enrico was standing outside, under a huge black umbrella, like he was waiting for someone, and when he saw me, he didn't seem even slightly surprised, like my appearance was exactly what he expected to happen. My stomach did that stupid flip that had become routine whenever I saw him. "Can I give you a ride?" The question came out too casual, like offering a ride to his favorite coffee shop barista in the rain was something completely normal, and not something that made my heart beat at the wrong rhythm. I tried to seem equally casual, and probably failed miserably. "You don't know where I live." "I do." He said this so naturally, so simply, that it took me 3 full seconds to process the real weight of that information. He knew where I lived, how, why, and more importantly, why didn't that make me run in the opposite direction? It should have scared me, should have set off all the danger alarms any sensible person would have. But instead, I just nodded and followed him to the black car parked on the corner, where one of the men who always waited outside opened the back door for us without saying a word. The car's interior smelled like expensive leather, and something I couldn't identify but was definitely masculine, and definitely him. And when I sat on the seat that was more comfortable than my own couch, I felt the space between us shrink, even with all the physical distance that still existed. He got in from the other side, and the driver started driving without needing an address, which confirmed that yes, he really knew where I lived, and I really should be more worried about this. The silence that settled in was strange, because it was too comfortable for 2 people who barely knew each other, who had never been alone in a closed space before, who had every reason in the world to be uncomfortable. But it wasn't uncomfortable, it was just loaded, heavy with unspoken things floating between us like dust particles in light. "Are you dangerous?" The question came out of nowhere, without planning, without filter, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I wanted to pull them back. But he didn't seem offended or surprised, just turned his face to look at me with those dark eyes that always studied me, and the answer came simple and honest. Yes, 1 word, that's it. No trying to soften it, no trying to protect me from the truth, just the raw confirmation of something I think I already knew deep down, but hadn't admitted out loud yet. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to come out steady. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know before you keep talking to me." He didn't look away, and there was something like respect in all that honesty, like I deserved the truth even if the truth was ugly and scary. I looked out the window, watching the rain run down the glass in random patterns, seeing the city lights blurred by the water, and thought about all the reasons why I should ask to get out of the car now, all the red flags that were waving violently in front of me. He waited without hurry, without trying to convince me, just waited to see what I'd decide. "Everyone's dangerous in some way." I finally spoke, still looking out the window because I didn't have the courage to look at him while saying that. "Not in my way, Nyla." The way he said my name, slowly and with weight, made something tighten in my chest. I didn't answer because I had no answer, but I also didn't ask to get out of the car, and we both knew what that silence meant. The rest of the trip passed in a strange fog, where I was hyper-aware of every breath he took, of every small movement, of the heat emanating from his body even with all the distance we maintained. When the car stopped in front of my building, that old Brooklyn building with the squeaky door and creaky stairs, I felt torn between wanting to run away and wanting to stay there forever. He got out first and opened my door before I could do it myself, and when I put my foot on the wet sidewalk, he was too close, blocking the rain with his umbrella in a way that created a small, intimate bubble just for the 2 of us. We walked to the building door like that, so close our shoulders almost touched, and every step seemed to carry a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. At the apartment door, after climbing 3 flights of stairs in heavy silence, he stood there, and the space between us was too small, too hot, too loaded with things I didn't know how to name. He looked at me like he always looked, with all that intensity, but this time there was something more, something that made my breathing fail. "Can I kiss you?" The question came out low, hoarse, and I opened my mouth to answer, but the wrong words came out first, before I could hold them back. before I could think about the consequences. I've never been kissed. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my face catch fire and covered my face with both hands, wanting to disappear, wanting the floor to open up and swallow me whole. Forget it. How embarrassing. His hands held my wrists gently, pulling my hands away from my face with a gentleness that completely contrasted with the power I felt emanating from him. Look at me. I forced my eyes to open, to look at him, and what I saw on his face wasn't judgment or pity, or any of the horrible things I expected to see. It was something like tenderness, like care, like a silent promise he was about to make out loud. Let's start slow. And then he kissed me, and the kiss was so careful, so different from everything I'd imagined a kiss would be, that I completely forgot to be embarrassed, forgot to breathe, forgot everything that wasn't the sensation of his lips on mine. Gentle and patient and devastatingly complete. He kissed me like he had all the time in the world, like there was no rush, like that moment was too important to be hurried. When he finally pulled away, my knees were weak, and my mind was empty of everything except the sensation of him, and he looked at me with those dark eyes that now seemed softer, warmer. Good night, Nyla. And then he left, going down the stairs with that silent confidence, leaving me standing at the apartment door trying to remember how breathing worked. I walked into the apartment floating, closed the door and leaned against it, bringing my fingers to my lips that were still tingling. My phone was exploding in my pocket with messages I'd completely ignored, and when I finally looked, I had 23 unread messages from Theo and 12 from Adeline. It was 3 in the morning when I finally managed to form enough words to respond. My hands were shaking when I typed the 3 most important words. I got kissed. The response came in less than 5 seconds. Theo, why didn't you answer my messages? Adeline sent right after, Theo, wake up. And then Theo, who apparently had never gone to sleep. I'm already awake. I never slept. I threw my phone on the bed and fell on my back, staring at the ceiling of my tiny room, still feeling his lips on mine, still feeling his warmth close to me, still trying to process that my first kiss had been with a dangerous man who knew where I lived, and who looked at me like I was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. And the scariest part of all of this was that I didn't regret it one bit. Chapter 3. The Girl Who Started Change.
I can do this.
I woke up the next morning with my lips still tingling and my head full of questions that hadn't let me sleep right. Theo and Adeline had bombarded the group chat all night with increasingly elaborate theories about who Enrico was, ranging from billionaire CEO to retired secret agent, and I'd ignored them all because the truth is, I didn't want to know. I wanted to stay in that bubble where he was just a man who kissed me carefully and looked at me like I mattered. But morning light has this cruel way of making reality hit harder, and when I sat on the bed with my laptop on my lap and my fingers hesitant over the keyboard, I knew I couldn't go on without knowing. I should have researched before, should have done this weeks ago, before the first kiss, before I let those dark eyes settle in my head in a way that seemed permanent. I typed his name with slightly shaking hands and hit enter before the courage ran away. The results appeared in less than a second, and every line I read made my stomach tighten more, made the air heavier in my lungs, made the world I knew smaller and scarier. Enrico Rinaldi, Don of the Rinaldi family, suspect in 3 federal investigations for money laundering and extortion, but never indicted, never arrested, always one step ahead of the law with lawyers who cost more per hour than I made in an entire month. Shell companies scattered across New York, properties in 4 different countries, and his name associated with a list of activities that made my stomach turn just reading them. I closed the laptop hard, like that could make the information disappear from my head. I took 3 deep breaths and opened it again, because maybe I'd read it wrong. Maybe it was someone else with the same name. Maybe the universe wasn't cruel enough to make my first kiss be with the head of the Italian Mafia in New York. But I hadn't read it wrong. It was him, with absolute and devastating certainty. There was even an old photo from some charity event, and even with the poor quality of the image, I'd recognize those eyes anywhere. That posture that took up space without asking permission. That presence that made everyone around seem smaller. I closed the laptop again, and this time didn't open it anymore. I sat on the bed for too long, staring at the white wall of my tiny room, trying to process that the man who had kissed me yesterday so gently was the same man who appeared in federal investigations, who ran a criminal organization, who was literally dangerous in the way he himself had admitted. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it with fingers that still trembled, opening the group that was now called Nyla Lad, because of Theo, and his obsession with giving dramatic names to everything. I typed the words before I could think too much about them. Guys, he's a mafia boss. The silence that followed lasted exactly 15 seconds, which in WhatsApp group time equaled a complete eternity. Then Theo responded with 2 ellipses, then 2 more, and finally the sentence I knew would come. I can't believe your first time kissing was with a Don. Adeline came in right after. Nyla, your life is a screenplay. And I, because I really didn't know what to do with all that information, typed the most pathetic question in the world. What do I do? Theo's answer came instant and absurdly confident. You continue, obviously. Adeline tried to be the voice of reason. Theo, but he cut her off with caps lock and everything. Adeline, she went 22 years without a kiss. And the first is from an Italian Mafia boss. The universe has spoken. I threw the phone on the bed and fell on my back, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide whether to laugh or cry or pretend none of this was happening. I had an online class in 2 hours and a shift at the coffee shop right after, and the only thing I could think about was that I'd have to see him today, would have to look at that face and pretend everything was fine, that finding out he was literally the head of the Mafia hadn't changed absolutely everything. When I got to the coffee shop 4 hours later, with dark circles that makeup couldn't hide, and a knot in my stomach that seemed permanent, the first thing I saw was him. Enrico was in line, waiting like always, dark suit like always, and when our eyes met, I felt my legs go weak, and my hand gripped the milk pitcher I was holding too hard. I stood there like an idiot, completely forgetting I had other customers waiting, forgetting I was in the middle of work, forgetting everything except the fact that this man was truly dangerous, and I'd let him kiss me, had liked it, had wanted more. He got to the front and made his usual order, with his usual voice, looking at me in his usual way, like yesterday was completely normal, like finding out he ran a criminal organization was just another irrelevant detail in our strange story. Coffee, no sugar. I made the coffee on autopilot, with slightly shaking hands, and when I placed the cup on the counter between us, our hands didn't touch this time, because I made sure to keep a safe distance. He took the coffee and went to his usual table, and for a moment, I thought things would continue exactly as they were, that we'd pretend nothing had changed. But then something inside me broke, or fixed itself. I'm not sure which, and I found myself walking to his table, sitting in the chair across from him without asking permission, without caring that other customers were watching with obvious curiosity, without caring that this was completely against protocol to do during my shift. I Googled your name. The words came out firm, firmer than I felt inside. He didn't seem surprised, just placed the cup back on the saucer with calculated care, and looked at me with that total attention he reserved only for me. I know. And? My voice came out challenging, wanting him to explain, to justify, to give me some reason not to run away from there. And the coffee is still no sugar. His answer was so absurdly calm, so completely unconcerned, that for a second I didn't know whether to laugh or throw the hot coffee at him. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain the control that was slipping through my fingers. You should have told me. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement, and he nodded as if he completely agreed. I should have. But I wanted you to know me before the name. His voice got lower, more intimate, and I felt that thing again, that magnetic attraction pulling me to him, even when my head screamed to do the opposite. Why? The question came out almost whispered, because I suddenly realized I really wanted to know that the answer mattered more than it should. He looked at me for a moment too long, and there was something in his eyes that looked like vulnerability, something that didn't fit with Mafia boss, but fit perfectly with the man who had kissed me carefully at my apartment door. Because everyone who knows the name first never sees me. They only see what the name represents. The silence that settled was heavy with unspoken truths, and I knew I was at a decision point, that what I said now would define everything that came after. And I saw you. You asked if I had anything better to do. The answer came with a small pause, and then he added something that made my chest tighten. Nobody asks that. Before I could respond, the coffee shop door opened and a man walked in. And by the way, Enrico straightened slightly. I knew it wasn't just any customer. The man was tall, with dark hair, and eyes that scanned the entire environment before landing on Enrico, and there was a familiarity between them that only came from years of working together. Dante, I realized somehow, even though I'd never seen him before. The right-hand man the internet mentioned in articles about the Rinaldi family, always 2 steps behind the Don, always vigilant, always present. Enrico stood up with that controlled elegance, and Dante looked at me for a second, registering everything without showing absolutely anything on his face. They left together, and I stayed sitting in the still warm chair, trying to process that my life had become something completely unrecognizable. In the car, Dante waited until they were 3 blocks away before asking the question he'd probably been holding since he saw them together. She knows who you are, she knows now. Enrico's answer came simple, without elaboration. And Dante kept his eyes on the road, but I could feel the tension in the question. And she's still serving me coffee. There was something like relief in his voice, something Dante registered with silent interest. Dante looked out the window, hiding the smallest smile in history, and thought he'd never seen the boss like this, had never seen Enrico Rinaldi care whether someone would keep serving him coffee or not. but he said nothing, just drove in silence, because some things were better left without words. 2 days later, he called me. I didn't have his number saved, but I recognized the voice before he even identified himself, and when he asked if I wanted to have dinner with him, the answer came out before my brain could veto it. Yes. Adeline went into full panic mode when I told her, dragging half my wardrobe out and declaring everything inadequate for dinner with Mafia boss. We ended up buying a simple black dress that she swore was perfect, even though I thought it looked like every other black dress that existed in the world. The restaurant was closed, just for the two of us. I realized this as soon as I walked in and saw the empty tables, the low lighting, the total absence of other customers, and my stomach tied into a knot that had less to do with nervousness and more to do with the realization of how much power a person needed to have to close down an entire restaurant on a Thursday night. He was waiting, dark suit as always, and when he saw me, something in his eyes softened in a way that made my heart race. I sat across from him and immediately started destroying the breadbasket because my hands needed to do something, and my mouth was too busy chewing to say something stupid. I ate the entire basket without realizing it, and only noticed when he ordered another from the waiter without commenting, without making a joke, just silently solving the problem. When I realized what I'd done, I felt my face heat up so much it probably glowed in the dark. "You're the only person who makes me want to stay longer somewhere." He said this suddenly, in the middle of dinner, like it was something he'd needed to say for a while, and had finally found the courage. I tried to keep my composure even with my heart beating irregularly. "You stay 90 minutes at a Brooklyn coffee shop every week." "Exactly." His answer came with a small, rare, devastating smile, and I knew in that moment I was completely lost, that it didn't matter how many federal investigations had his name on them, didn't matter how dangerous he was, I'd already decided to stay. Chapter 4. Welcome to his world. Part 1. The shock.
I don't belong here.
Enrico mentioned the event casually, like he was inviting me for coffee and not to a business reception with people who probably had more money in their wallet than I had in my bank account. "Just show up. 2 hours." He said this while finishing his coffee, looking at me with those dark eyes that made me agree to things my sensible brain would veto if it had time to process. I agreed, because the idea of being next to him, of seeing the world he occupied when he wasn't sitting across from me in a Brooklyn coffee shop, seemed important in some twisted way. I didn't know yet that there was an unwritten dress code, an unspoken hierarchy, and an entire social language nobody teaches you, because if you need to be taught, you already don't belong. The apartment became a war zone 3 hours before the event. Adeline was sitting on the floor surrounded by half my wardrobe and half of hers, with that expression of controlled desperation she reserved for true fashion crises. Theo was on the couch with a glass of wine at 5 in the afternoon, offering comments that alternated between useful and completely absurd. "You can't just go any old way, Nyla." Adeline threw another dress on the rejected pile, which was already bigger than the possible pile. "These people are going to scan you head to toe in less than 3 seconds and decide whether you belong or not." Theo waved his glass, almost spilling wine on the crappy rug we'd had since we moved in. "She needs to look like she was born rich without looking like she's trying to look like she was born rich." He made a dramatic pause. "It's a thin and dangerous line." I looked at both of them with a furrowed brow, trying to understand how that made sense in any parallel universe. "Does that make sense to you two?" "Yes." They answered in unison, without hesitation, and continued debating fabrics and necklines like my life depended on it, which maybe it did in ways I still couldn't fully comprehend. We ended up choosing a dress Adeline swore was perfect, in a shade of dark blue she called Midnight, and I called just blue. It was simple enough not to look like I was trying too hard, but elegant enough not to look like I'd grabbed it from the clearance rack at the cheapest store in Brooklyn. When Enrico arrived to pick me up, punctual as always, Theo was glued to the window watching like it was live Netflix. "His car is the size of our apartment, Nyla," he murmured with obvious reverence, and Adeline had to physically pull him away from the curtain before Enrico noticed he was being watched like an animal at the zoo. The event was at a hotel I only knew from walking past and thinking I'd never have a reason to go inside. The lobby had too much marble, too many chandeliers, and flowers that probably cost more than my entire rent. Enrico placed his hand on my back, guiding me with that naturalness of someone used to navigating these spaces, and I tried not to look like a lost child in a museum. The first thing I noticed when we entered the ballroom were the women. They all wore jewelry that sparkled under the indirect lights, and I didn't need to be an expert to know those diamonds were real, that those dresses had labels I couldn't pronounce correctly, that every purse hanging on delicate arms was worth more than my old car that barely worked. The second thing I noticed was how the men greeted Enrico. There was respect there, the kind of respect that came wrapped in poorly disguised fear, in smiles that didn't reach the eyes, in handshakes too firm to be natural. They treated him like he was simultaneously their best friend and the most dangerous person in the room, and I realized the second option was probably more accurate. I stayed by his side all night, absorbing everything with that silent attention I'd developed working with the public, watching how each person moved, how they talked, how they laughed at jokes that weren't funny and agreed with opinions they probably didn't share. It was like watching a play where everyone knew the lines except me, a woman with impeccable blonde hair and a dress that looked liquid. It was so well cut, approached with a smile that showed teeth too white. She looked me up and down with that speed Adeline had warned me about, and I saw the verdict form in her eyes before she even opened her mouth. "Sweetheart, where did you go to school?" The question came wrapped in false curiosity, and I knew the right answer was some Ivy League university, some heavy name that would open automatic doors. "I'm studying graphic design," I began, but she'd already cut me off with that O that meant everything but O. The O that said, "You don't belong here, you're not one of us, you're temporary and irrelevant and we all know it." She didn't need to say anything else, just smiled in that polite and empty way before turning to talk to someone more interesting, leaving me there with the sentence half finished and the growing certainty that I'd entered a game without knowing the rules. Another woman, older, with pearls on her neck that seemed to have their own history, asked what I did for a living with that tone that already indicated any answer would be inadequate. "I work at a coffee shop." The words barely came out, and I saw the corner of mouth smile, that smile that needed no translation because the message was universal. How adorable. How common. Nyla understood the language even without having studied it. Understood that interesting meant horrible, that brave meant wrong, and that polite silence was worth more than any pretty lie. It was an entire communication happening between the lines, in exchanged looks when they thought I wasn't watching, in calculated pauses before answering my questions. Enrico noticed. Of course he noticed. He paid attention to me the way he paid attention to threats, with that constant vigilance that never rested. When the third woman walked away after making me feel the size of an insect, he leaned slightly in my direction, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Are they being kind?" The question came without judgment, just genuine curiosity about my reading of the situation. I looked at him and decided on honesty, because lying to Enrico Rinaldi seemed pointless when he probably read people better than I read menus. They're being polite. I saw something pass through his eyes, something that could be approval or pride or satisfaction that I'd distinguish the difference so quickly. He almost smiled, that almost smile I was starting to recognize, which meant I'd said exactly the right thing. I went to the bathroom after an hour of conversations about places I'd never visited and investments I didn't understand, and as soon as I locked the marble door of the absurdly spacious stall, I grabbed my phone with slightly trembling fingers. The group exploded on the screen as soon as I opened it. I typed fast, before anyone noticed my absence. "Guys, these women are terrifying." Theo responded in less than 5 seconds. "Details." Adeline sent 3 exclamation points in a row, and I could imagine both of them sitting on the apartment couch, probably with wine, definitely in solidarity panic. They smile, but their eyes don't participate. I sent the observation that had disturbed me all night, this strange disconnect between facial expression and real intention. Adeline responded with the wisdom of someone who watched documentaries about predators. Classic Savannah predator. Theo sent right after, "You're the main character, narrate everything." And I would have laughed if I weren't genuinely uncomfortable with how accurate that was. I went back to the ballroom trying to look composed, but I felt the weight of the environment in every step. In the way conversations stopped when I passed too close, how looks followed me with curiosity that bordered on predatory. They were measuring me, weighing me, deciding if I was a threat or entertainment or both. That's when I saw her for the first time. Blair Whitmore approached at the end of the night, when I was already mentally exhausted from smiling at people who looked at me like I was an interesting scientific experiment. She was too beautiful to be an accident, the kind of beauty that came from lucky genetics and expensive maintenance, with hair that fell perfectly on her shoulders, and a smile that showed all her white, sharp teeth. "You're so refreshing." The word came out wrapped in gift paper, but the content inside was pure poison, and I knew this even without having the complete vocabulary to name it. It was an insult disguised as a compliment, condescension packaged in false sympathy, the kind of thing women like Blair did so well they could deny it later if someone confronted them. "Thank you." I responded with a smile that hurt my face muscles, because I didn't yet know how to respond to attacks that came dressed as kindnesses, how to defend myself from knives that looked like flowers on the surface. Blair looked at Enrico with that familiarity that only came from shared history, then looked at me, and then back at him, and the message was clear to everyone in the room except me, who was still learning the grammar of that cruel language. She was marking territory, warning that I was an invader, making it clear that my presence there was temporary and tolerated but never accepted. In the car going back, the silence was heavy with unspoken things. I looked out the window, watching New York lights pass by blurred, trying to process the entire night, trying to understand why I felt so small when I'd walked in thinking I could hold my own importance. "That woman, Blair," I began, my voice coming out lower than I intended. Enrico cut me off before I could finish the thought, his voice firm and without room for negotiation. "Don't get close to her." I turned to look at him. seeing his profile lit by the streetlights, seeing the tension in his jaw that indicated this wasn't a casual suggestion. Why? Because I know that type. The answer came after a calculated pause, like he was choosing his words carefully, the type that smiles more when they're planning something. I filed the information away with that attention I was developing for important things, for warnings that came wrapped in simplicity, but carried real weight. Blair Whitmore was danger, that was clear, but the kind of danger that came in high heels and expensive perfume, the kind I didn't yet know how to identify before it was too late. When we got to my building, he got out of the car with me this time, walked me to the door like he'd done the first time, and stood there in that small space between us that seemed to carry its own electricity. I expected him to kiss me again, wanted him to kiss me, but he just ran his hand over my face with a gentleness that contrasted with everything I'd seen from him that night. "You did well." The words came low, intimate, and I felt that compliment way more than any other I'd received in my life. It didn't feel like it. The honesty came out before I could wrap it in something more palatable. "Because you haven't learned yet to see when you're winning." He tilted his head slightly, studying my face with that total attention. "But you will." And then he left, leaving me at the door with more questions than answers, with the feeling of being thrown into deep water without knowing how to swim, and with the growing certainty that his world was going to change me in ways I still couldn't fully predict. I walked into the apartment and found Theo and Adeline still awake, waiting on the couch like worried parents waiting for their teenage daughter to come back from a questionable party. I told them everything in cinematic detail, while Adeline took mental notes, and Theo reacted with increasingly dramatic facial expressions. When I finished, Adeline looked at me with that seriousness she reserved for important moments. "Nyla, you realize you've entered a completely different world, right? With rules nobody's going to teach you and people who are going to test you just to see if you break?" I nodded because yes, I'd realized. I'd felt it in every condescending look, in every fake smile, in every second of that endless night. Theo took my hand with uncommon affection for someone normally so dramatic. "But you're Nyla," he said with absolute conviction. "And Nyla always figures things out. It might take time, it might hurt, but you always figure it out." I wanted to believe him, wanted to have all that confidence. But the truth is, I was scared in ways I couldn't name, scared of the world I'd seen, of the people who had measured me and found me insufficient, of the certainty that Blair Whitmore was just the beginning of something much bigger and more dangerous. And the scariest part was that even knowing all this, even feeling the danger as real as the air in my lungs, I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay, wanted to learn, wanted to find out if I could belong to a world that clearly didn't want me there. That said something about me I wasn't ready to examine too closely yet. Chapter 5.
Will you accept my offer, Nyla?
3 weeks after the first event, I'd already attended 5, and at each one I learned a bit more of the invisible grammar that governed that world. Enrico started introducing me gradually, with that calculated care he used for everything. But the world was in a hurry and didn't wait for careful schedules. People wanted to know who I was, why I was there, how long I'd last before disappearing like the others who'd tried before. I discovered I had photographic memory for faces and names, something I'd never noticed working at the coffee shop because there everyone was just the cappuccino lady or the double espresso guy. But here names mattered, connections mattered. Knowing who was allied with whom, and who quietly hated whom, while smiling at events made the difference between belonging and being tolerated. I was at a smaller, more intimate event when Enrico mentioned something about Cavalli's advisor, and before I could control myself, I dropped the name of the man who'd been introduced 2 weeks ago in a hallway conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds. Enrico stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with that total attention he reserved for things that surprised him, and surprises weren't frequent in his life. "How do you know Cavalli's advisor's name?" The question came genuinely curious, without judgment, just pure interest in understanding how my brain worked. I shrugged like it was obvious. "He mentioned it once. I pay attention. Most people don't." There was something in his eyes that looked like impression, maybe even respect, and I felt that look like it was a physical touch. Most people think employees are invisible. The words came out with more weight than I intended, loaded with years of serving coffee to people who looked through me like I was part of the furniture. "I've been an employee my whole life." He looked at me differently after that, like he'd just seen something that had been there all along, but he hadn't paid attention to yet. It was the kind of look that made my stomach flip and my breathing fail, and I had to look away before doing something stupid like admitting how much all that attention affected me. It was Dante who started answering my questions. I'm not exactly sure how it started, maybe because I asked the right questions, the ones that weren't about power or money or influence, but about people, about behaviors, about the invisible patterns I was starting to recognize but still didn't fully understand. We were at an event when I noticed a man who always stayed near the exit, never more than 3 meters from the main door, and curiosity was stronger than common sense. I turned to Dante, who was 2 steps behind Enrico as always, and asked the question I probably shouldn't ask. Why does that man always stay near the exit? I kept my voice low, aware that wrong questions could reveal dangerous ignorance. Dante looked at me for a moment, assessing whether he should answer or not, and then decided yes, that I deserved to know, or maybe that I was already too deep to be protected from truths, because he's had to leave fast once. The answer came loaded with untold history, with implicit violence, with memories that left permanent marks on behaviors. I nodded, absorbing the information, and then my eyes found another man, always with a glass in hand, but who never really drank. And the other one who never drinks. The question came out before I could filter it, before I could decide if it was safe to ask. Because he already lost something when he let his guard down. Dante's answer came in the same neutral tone, but there was a warning there, a lesson wrapped in an example. He looked at me then, with that analytical attention he used to assess threats, but this time it wasn't hostility, it was recognition. You read people. I've worked with the public for 4 years. I explained with simplicity that didn't reveal how much that skill was saving me from mistakes that could cost dearly in that world. Dante nodded and didn't say anything else, but after that day, he started answering my questions more frequently, teaching me without seeming like he was teaching, giving me tools I'd need to survive in an environment that had no instruction manual. The most surreal scene of my life happened on a Thursday afternoon when Enrico showed up at the apartment for the first time. I'd given him the address without thinking much about it, assuming he'd send a driver to pick me up like he always did. But when the doorbell rang and I opened the door, it was him standing there, dark suit as always, occupying the narrow hallway of my crappy building like it was a palace. Theo was in the hallway coming from the kitchen, holding a bowl of cereal that was probably his afternoon snack even though it was 4 o'clock. He saw Enrico and simply stopped, froze mid-movement, with the spoon halfway to his mouth, eyes wide like he'd seen a ghost or a celebrity or both. Enrico looked at him with that terrifying calm, unhurried, just registering the presence of another person in the apartment. Theo looked at Enrico, then at me, then back at Enrico, and I could see the gears in his brain spinning at maximum speed, trying to process that the head of the Italian Mafia in New York was standing in our Brooklyn apartment hallway. "You must be Theo." Enrico said this with naturalness that made it seem like encounters like this happened every day, and his voice sounded perfectly normal in the small space we occupied. Theo looked at me with eyes so wide they seemed ready to pop out of his face, the cereal bowl trembling slightly in his hands. "He knows my name." The words came out in a loud whisper that definitely wasn't discreet. I tried to save the situation before Theo had a complete nervous breakdown. "I mentioned you," I began, but Theo was already extending his hand to Enrico, with determination that only came from living a moment too surreal to worry about protocol. "I'm your biggest fan." Theo said this with absolute seriousness, looking straight into Enrico's eyes without blinking, and for a second I thought the Italian Mafia Don would find this offensive or strange, or at least inappropriate, but Enrico just shook his hand without blinking, without smiling, just accepting the declaration like it was a normal fact, and not a bizarre confession from a dramatic 23-year-old gay guy who watched too much Netflix. "Nice to meet you, Theo." When Enrico left 20 minutes later, Theo waited exactly 15 seconds before exploding. He grabbed his phone with fingers that still trembled and started typing in the group chat with speed that defied the laws of physics. The messages came in a cascade. While I was still processing that interaction had actually happened. "He has a firm handshake," Nyla was the first, followed immediately by Adeline. "You shook hands with the Mafia boss," with 3 exclamation points that indicated elevated stress levels. Theo responded with unwavering conviction. And it was the best thing that happened to me this year. And I didn't doubt for a second that he was serious, that he'd keep that moment as a precious story to tell for the rest of his life. The tension started growing in ways I was still learning to recognize. Blair Whitmore approached me at an event, all smiles and fake sympathy, and made the invitation I knew would come eventually, but that still caught me off guard. "Some of us are having lunch next week, to get to know each other better." The words came out sweet as poisoned honey. "You should come." I looked at Enrico instinctively, looking for guidance or approval or any sign of what I should do, and saw the answer in his eyes before he even opened his mouth. No, of course not. This was a trap wrapped in a social invitation, a test disguised as kindness, and he didn't want me anywhere near it. But something inside me rebelled against that constant protection, against being guided and protected like I couldn't make my own decisions or fight my own battles. I smiled at Blair and accepted the invitation before my sensible brain could veto it. In the car going back home, the silence was heavy with unspoken disapproval. Enrico drove with total attention on the road, but I felt the tension emanating from him like heat, felt how much that decision had bothered him in ways he was trying to control. "I can't be afraid of everything." The words came out more defensive than I intended, loaded with frustration that had been growing for weeks. "It's not fear, it's strategy." His answer came controlled, measured, but I heard the mirrored frustration there, the desire to protect me clashing against my insistence on exposing myself. Then teach me the strategy, instead of protecting me from it. I turned to look at him, seeing his profile lit by the streetlights, seeing the tension in his jaw that indicated I'd touched on something important. He stayed quiet for too long, and I felt that silence weigh more than any argument. It was the first time I'd truly challenged him, the first time I'd refused the protection he offered so naturally, and I could feel something shifting between us, something adjusting to accommodate this new dynamic. When he finally spoke, his voice came out lower, more thoughtful. You're right. He stopped at the red light and really looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that looked like pride mixed with concern. I'll teach you. And I knew then that I'd won something, that I'd forced a change he didn't expect to make. And the most unsettling part was that he seemed to like it, seemed to appreciate the challenge, even though it bothered him to appreciate it. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about how my life had become something unrecognizable in a matter of weeks. I'd gone from invisible barista to girlfriend of the Mafia boss who was learning to navigate a world that 3 months ago I didn't even know existed. And the scariest part was that I was starting to like it, was starting to feel that maybe, just maybe, I could find my place in that world that clearly hadn't been made for people like me. But first I needed to survive lunch with Blair Whitmore and her friends. And that, more than anything else, seemed like the real test of how much I'd learned and how much I still needed to learn. Chapter 6. The Dress and the Day. She stopped being nice.
I'm done being nice.
The gala dinner was the most important event so far, and I knew this by the way Enrico had mentioned 3 times that he needed to arrive early, that he had meetings that couldn't wait, that Dante would pick me up and take me there safely. That should have been the first warning that the night was going to be different, more dangerous, more loaded with bad possibilities, but I was too busy choosing a dress with Adeline to pay attention to the signs. 3 hours. It took us 3 full hours to choose the red dress that Adeline finally declared perfect, with that absolute conviction she reserved for important fashion decisions. It was dark red, elegant in a way I'd never been before, and when I looked at myself in the mirror for the 20th time, I saw someone who almost seemed to belong to that world of crystals and polite lies. Dante arrived punctually at 7, and there was something comforting about his silent presence, in the way he opened the car door without saying anything unnecessary, in the constant attention he paid to the surroundings like he was always expecting trouble to appear. He was escort and bodyguard and babysitter all at once, and I was starting to appreciate all that vigilance more than my pride wanted to admit. The event was in a ballroom that made the others look small and insignificant, with a ceiling too high and chandeliers that probably cost more than entire houses. When I walked in, I felt all eyes turn in my direction for a second, before deciding I wasn't important enough for prolonged attention. I was starting to recognize that pattern, that quick assessment followed by equally quick dismissal. Enrico was on the other side of the ballroom, surrounded by men in suits who gestured while they talked, and when our eyes met across the crowd, he nodded slightly, silent acknowledgement that he'd seen me, that he knew where I was, that he was paying attention, even though he seemed completely absorbed in business conversation. That's when Blair approached with that smile I'd learned to recognize as dangerous, surrounded by a group of women who looked like predators who'd found prey alone and vulnerable. They formed a circle around me with practiced naturalness, and I felt the space get smaller, tighter, more suffocating. The conversation started apparently friendly. Questions about how I was doing, if I was enjoying the events, that false cordiality that hid much less kind intentions. I answered on autopilot, smiling at the right moments, nodding when appropriate, and that's exactly why I didn't see it coming. The champagne spilled in front of me in a movement that seemed accidental, the blonde woman next to me apologizing profusely while trying to help clean, and that's when I felt the dress fabric give, the small and devastating sound of the tear running down my back, leaving my skin exposed in the middle of the ballroom full of people who were definitely paying attention now. It wasn't an accident. The way it was done, the perfect coordination between the spilled champagne and the hands that pulled the fabric while pretending to clean, left zero doubt that this had been planned with surgical precision. Blair took a step back with an expression of performative horror, bringing her hand to her mouth like she was genuinely shocked by what had happened. And I felt the anger rise up my throat mixed with humiliation that burned more than anything physical. Preston Vale appeared before I could move, before I could fully process what had happened, with that smile that showed he'd expected exactly this, that he'd been there nearby waiting for the right moment to act. He was handsome in a conventional and empty way, with perfectly arranged hair and a suit that screamed old money, and his eyes traveled over my exposed skin with interest that made my stomach turn. "Let me help you." The words came out syrupy, and his hands approached my body without waiting for permission, without asking if I wanted help, just assuming he had the right to touch me because I was vulnerable and exposed. "Don't touch me." The words came out firmer than I felt, cutting the air between us with clarity that left no room for interpretation. He didn't stop, his fingers inches from my skin, the smile getting wider like my refusal was adorable and irrelevant. Relax, I said don't touch me. This time the words came out ice cold, loaded with something I didn't know I had inside, and he finally stopped, but the smile didn't completely disappear. There were 2 more men nearby now, and I could hear the low laughs, the comments I couldn't fully make out but knew were about me, about my exposed body, about my vulnerability that they saw as opportunity and not as reason to offer real help. The entire ballroom was watching, some people with poorly disguised pity, others with obvious satisfaction, and all with that morbid interest of people watching a live show. Dante arrived cutting through the crowd with a presence that made people instinctively step back, and in one quick and efficient movement, he removed his jacket and placed it over my shoulders, covering my exposed back with care that contrasted with the absolutely lethal expression on his face. He looked at me for a second, searching for signs of tears or collapse or any of the expected reactions, but I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crumbling into small pieces in the middle of the ballroom while everyone watched. Something had closed inside me the moment the dress tore, a door I didn't know existed, but that was now locked with a heavy bolt, and on the other side of that door was the Neela, who thought everyone deserved kindness, who gave second chances, who assumed the best in people. That Neela had died in the middle of the ballroom with a torn dress, and men who thought vulnerability was an invitation, and the one who remained in her place had a closed face in a way Dante had never seen, had eyes that registered every person who had laughed, every face that had shown satisfaction instead of empathy, and was cataloging everything with attention that promised permanent memory. Enrico arrived seconds later, and I saw the exact moment he read the entire scene, when his eyes traveled over the jacket on my shoulders, the back of the torn dress visible underneath, Preston still too close, and the crowd watching with interest that bordered on predatory. I also saw the moment when something darkened in that always controlled face, when the room's temperature changed in a way everyone felt, but few fully understood. But he came to me first, ignoring Preston, ignoring Blair, ignoring everyone except me, and when he stood in front of me, blocking the other's view with his body, his voice came out low and controlled in a way that was scarier than any scream. "Are you okay?" The question deserved honesty, and I gave it to him without wrapping it in anything more palatable. "No." Pause. "But I will be." Something passed through his eyes, something that looked like pride mixed with contained fury, and he took off his own jacket from his 3-piece suit, leaving only the vest and shirt, and placed it over me on top of Dante's, wrapping me in fabric that smelled like him and felt like armor against all the looks that still followed me. He looked at me for a long moment, and in that look was a silent promise that this wouldn't stay like this, that there would be consequences, that people didn't touch what was his without paying a high price. Then he turned, and the change was so drastic I saw several people instinctively step back. The environment changed temperature, like someone had opened all the windows in the middle of winter. Enrico walked to Preston with that terrifying calm that only came from absolute confidence in consequences, and when he stopped in front of him, Preston tried to maintain his smile, but I saw when it started to disappear, when fear started to replace arrogance. Enrico spoke too low for anyone to hear except Preston, leaning slightly like he was sharing a secret, and every word that came out of that mouth made Preston go paler, more tense, more obviously terrified. It didn't last more than 30 seconds, this silent conversation that no one else could hear, but when it ended, Preston was white as paper and was nodding repeatedly like a puppet agreeing with everything. He left the event without saying goodbye to anyone, without looking back, practically running to the exit, and I registered that with cold satisfaction. That was completely new to me. I didn't feel sorry. I didn't feel guilty. I only felt that justice had been served in a way I still didn't fully understand, but appreciated anyway. In the car going back, with both jackets still over my shoulders and heavy silence between us, I finally asked the question I needed to ask. "What did you say to him?" Enrico was looking out the window, and when he answered, his voice came out too casual for the weight of the words. "Nothing that needs repeating. Enrico, he won't get close to any woman in this circle anytime soon." The answer came final, definitive, and I knew I wasn't going to get more details than that some things were better left without complete explanation. I grabbed my phone with fingers that were finally starting to tremble now that I was safe, now that I could lower my guard without an audience watching every move. The group was exploding with messages I'd completely ignored during the entire event. I typed with fingers that still trembled slightly. They tore my dress in the middle of the event. The responses came in a cascade. "Theo, what do you mean?" Adeline, "Who?" And I, because I needed to say it out loud even if it was by text, typed the naked truth. Blair, calculated, in front of everyone. Theo sent 3 messages in quick sequence. "Nyla, I need you to breathe," followed by "Call me now," followed by "I'm freaking out here," but I wasn't ready to call. Wasn't ready to hear their voices and have to explain in detail what had happened, how I'd felt, how I still felt. So I typed the words that had been burning inside me since the dress had torn. "I'm breathing. Pause. while I thought about how to explain what had changed. And I'm thinking. Adeline responded quickly. Thinking what? And I, with clarity that came from something new and sharp inside me, typed the truth that had taken months to learn but now seemed obvious. That I was nice to people who don't deserve kindness. The digital silence that followed lasted 10 full seconds, which in group time equaled eternity. Then Theo sent the message that summed everything up perfectly. She became the real protagonist, Adeline, and the scariest part was that he was right, that something fundamental had changed that night, that the Nyla who had entered the event with a red dress, a naive hope of being accepted, wasn't the same Nyla who had left with 2 jackets over her shoulders and a mental list of people who had shown exactly who they were when they thought I was too vulnerable to remember. I looked out the window watching New York lights pass by blurred, feeling the heavy jackets on my shoulders, and knew with absolute certainty that I was never going to be nice again to people who confused kindness with weakness, gentleness with stupidity, vulnerability with opportunity. That version of me had died in the middle of the ballroom, and the one born in her place was something I didn't fully know yet, but was eager to discover. Chapter 7.
You need to understand every rule.
Teach me everything.
2 days after the torn dress, Blair Whitmore woke up and discovered the world had gotten smaller overnight. Her husband's company lost 3 major contracts that had seemed guaranteed for months, contracts that represented numbers with lots of zeros and that disappeared without official explanation, just vague excuses about strategic direction changes that everyone knew were polite lies. Invitations to the next 4 social events were discreetly canceled, one at a time, with calculated intervals so she'd noticed the pattern, but couldn't complain publicly without admitting she'd been banned. And her 2 closest friends, the ones who had helped with the spilled champagne and the torn dress, received compromising information about Blair that coincidentally landed in their husbands' hands the same week. No violence, no direct threat that could be traced. Just the heavy silence of someone who could make your life much smaller without raising their voice, without making a scene, without leaving visible marks that could be shown as proof. It was surgical revenge. Precise, devastating in its simplicity, and Blair understood the message with crystal clarity. The flowers arrived at the coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, a huge arrangement that took up half the counter and made the other employees stop to admire. White roses, expensive, the kind that came from an exclusive florist and not a corner store, and the attached card had perfect handwriting that probably cost extra. I opened the card knowing exactly who had sent them, and the words were studied, careful, an apology that sounded sincere, but that I knew had been written under pressure of real fear. My sincere apologies for what happened. It was unforgivable. Blair Enrico was sitting at his usual table when this happened, watching over the documents he was pretending to read, and our eyes met across the noisy coffee shop. I grabbed the entire arrangement, flowers and vase and card, and walked to the trash can in the back, throwing it all inside with one single, definitive movement. I came back to the counter cleaning my hands like I'd touched something dirty, and when I looked at Enrico again, he was watching me with that total attention, that interest that made my stomach flip even after months of knowing that look. I don't need the flowers. The words came out firm, without anger, just a statement of fact. I know. He responded with a voice low enough for only me to hear, even with the distance between us. Heavy pause, but she needed to send them. I nodded because I understood perfectly. Understood that the flowers weren't for me, but part of her punishment. One more small humiliation of having to admit fault and apologize to someone she'd tried to destroy. It was a lesson being taught, and I was just a tool in Blair Whitmore's education. That night, sitting in the apartment with Theo and Adeline watching some reality show I wasn't paying attention to, I made the decision that had been forming since the torn dress. I needed to learn to move in that world for real, not as a protected girlfriend, but as someone who understood the rules, who knew how to play the game, who could defend herself when Enrico wasn't around. The next day, I looked for Dante before the event we had that night. He was leaning against the car, checking his phone with attention that was never just casual, and when I approached, his eyes scanned me automatically, before relaxing when he recognized it was me. I need you to teach me how to move in this world. The words came out direct, without beating around the bush, because I'd learned from Enrico that asking for what you want clearly saved time and confusion. Dante looked at me for a long moment, assessing intention and seriousness, and then did something I didn't expect. He looked over my shoulder to where Enrico was coming out of the building, and the silent question passed between them with that communication that only came from years of working together. Enrico nodded slightly, permission given without words, and Dante turned his attention back to me. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. The answer came without elaboration, but I knew it was a real commitment, that he was going to teach me what I needed to know. The training started at a different coffee shop from mine, at a neutral place where Dante could watch me watching others without seeming suspicious. He put me at a corner table and asked the question that would be the first test of many. What do you see? I looked around the coffee shop, letting my eyes travel over the people scattered at the tables, and started cataloging with the attention I'd developed working with the public for years. Man near the window is monitoring the entrance. He looks every time the door opens, and his right hand stays near his jacket pocket in a way that seems casual, but isn't. Dante said nothing, just nodded for me to continue. Woman in blue is angry at her husband, but pretending not to be. She smiles when he talks, but her eyes are hard and she's holding the cup too tight. That man over there. Enough. Dante cut me off with a voice that carried something that could be impression or concern. You learn too fast. That's unsettling. I smiled despite myself, feeling small, warm pride in my chest for having passed the test without knowing I was being tested. Dante spent the next 2 hours teaching me the social language of the elite, that language of subtext and calculated silences I'd been learning through trial and error. When someone says interesting about something of yours, what are they really saying? He asked like a teacher giving an oral exam. That they think it's horrible, but are too polite to say so. The answer came automatic, learned through painful experiences at events full of people who smiled while stabbing me with polite words. And when they say brave, that they think it's wrong and would never do it. That one had been harder to learn, because brave sounded like a compliment until you noticed the tone and context, and the way people pulled away right after saying it. Dante nodded with silent approval. And the most powerful weapon you have in these situations? I thought for a moment, going over all the conversations I'd observed, all the moments when I'd seen real power being exercised. Strategic silence. Why? Because it's worth more than any answer. It makes people think you know more than you really do, and lets them fill the void with their own fears. He almost smiled. That almost smile that seemed to be a genetic characteristic of the Rinaldi family, and I knew I'd gotten it completely right. Enrico started teaching me too, but in different ways, in moments stolen between meetings and events. We were entering an important dinner when he stopped at the door, blocking my entrance with his body in a subtle way. When you enter a place, don't look for the loudest ones. The instruction came low, just for me. I frowned, not understanding immediately. Why? Because real power doesn't need noise. He looked at me with that intensity that made my stomach flip. Look for the quiet ones, the ones who stay at the edges observing, the ones who speak little, but are heard when they speak. I nodded, absorbing the information, and when we entered the ballroom, I used that lesson immediately, my eyes looking not for the men who laughed loudly and dominated conversations, but for those who stayed slightly apart, who observed more than they participated, who had heavy presence even in silence. I told Theo and Adeline everything on a Friday night when the 3 of us were in the apartment with Chinese food spread across the coffee table. Theo was on the floor with his laptop on his lap, pretending to do work, but actually giving me total attention. Wait, he raised his hand like he was in school. You're being trained by the Mafia boss's right-hand man. Yeah, I confirmed while fighting with chopsticks that never cooperated. Adeline looked at me with that expression that clearly said my life had become a movie script. This is a reality show, Nyla. I know. The words came out more exasperated than I intended, because yes, my life had become something absurd, but it was my life now, and I was trying to survive it. Theo completely dropped the laptop. Total attention on me now. When's the next lesson? I want to go. I looked at him with obvious incredulity. Theo, as a supporting character, I have rights. He declared this with absolute seriousness, and Adeline had to cover her mouth to hide her laugh. It was at the next event that I met Silvana. She appeared out of nowhere, elegant in a way Blair tried to be, but Silvana was naturally, with that confidence that came from years navigating that world, and knowing exactly where each piece fit on the board. She was different from Blair in fundamental ways. Blair acted out of jealousy, out of insecurity disguised as superiority, but Silvana acted out of calculated interest, out of long-term strategy, and when she approached me for a private conversation in a corner of the ballroom, I knew I was being evaluated by completely different criteria. You understand this world is going to change you? The question came without beating around the bush, without the false kindness Blair used as a weapon. I looked her straight in the eyes, using all the new confidence Dante and Enrico had taught me to project. It's already changing me. Silvana tilted her head slightly, genuine interest crossing that perfectly composed face. And what if what you become isn't who you want to be? The question was good, was valid, and deserved an honest answer even coming from someone I was still deciding whether was a threat or not. I looked at her with calm. I didn't have months ago, with that new serenity that had been born from the torn dress and lessons learned in blood and humiliation. I'd rather choose who I become than let others choose for me. I saw the exact moment Silvana recalculated, when her assessment of me changed from temporary and irrelevant to potentially permanent and interesting. She didn't expect that answer, didn't expect that clarity, and I registered that surprise as a small but significant victory. She pulled away after that without saying anything else, but I knew I hadn't seen the last of her, that women like Silvana didn't give up easily on arrangements that benefited them. But I also knew I'd passed the first test, that I'd shown I wasn't easy prey, that I had my own teeth even though I was still learning how to use them. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about how I'd changed in such a short time. The Neela who had served Enrico coffee for the first time would never have been able to look Silvana in the eyes and declare autonomy over her own transformation. But the Neela of now, the one who had survived Blair and was being trained by Dante, and was learning the language of power with Enrico, this Neela was becoming something new. And for the first time since everything began, I wasn't afraid of what I was becoming. I was curious, I was determined, but I wasn't afraid. That, more than anything else, told me the transformation was already complete in ways I still couldn't see fully. Chapter 8.
I belong here, Schriftherringer.
6 months after the torn dress, I was a different person. Not completely different, not unrecognizable, but transformed in ways that only became obvious when you looked closely, when you paid attention to the small details that made all the difference. I still laughed with my whole body when I found something genuinely funny, still worked at the coffee shop on Thursdays because that space reminded me where I came from and who I was, underneath all the transformation. But I'd lost that dangerous naivety of thinking everyone deserved the complete version of me, that kindness needed to be universal and unlimited to be real. I learned to enter an environment and be read as someone who belonged there, not through arrogance or pretension, but through quiet confidence that came from knowing my own value. I learned that saying little and communicating much was an art worth gold in that world of masks and half-truths. I learned that presence was more powerful than volume, that strategic silence was worth more than defensive monologues, that looking someone in the eyes without blinking first was a declaration of strength everyone understood instinctively. The event was medium in terms of importance, neither small enough to be irrelevant, nor big enough to be dangerous, and I was alone because Enrico had a meeting he couldn't postpone, and Dante was with him. 6 months ago, this would have terrified me. The idea of navigating that world without an escort or protection or someone to save me if I made a fatal social mistake. But now I knew how to move on my own. The woman approached with that smile I'd learned to recognize in less than 3 seconds, that curve of lips that came without warmth in the eyes, without genuine intention of connection. She was new to the circle, newer than me in terms of time, but older in terms of age, and there was that arrogance in her that came from thinking lifetime equaled automatic wisdom. It must be hard for you, so young, trying to fit into such a complex world. The words came out wrapped in false empathy, and 6 months ago I would have stammered something defensive, would have apologized for existing, would have let that comment make me feel small and inadequate. But I wasn't that Nyla anymore. I looked at her with calm that came from won battles and lessons learned in public humiliation, and smiled slowly, that kind of smile Enrico used when he was about to destroy someone politely. You're trying to diminish me because I'm new here. I get it. The words came out low, almost conversational, and I saw her eyes widen slightly at the raw honesty. But I need to tell you that the last people who tried that aren't attending these events anymore. I let the sentence hang in the air for 2 seconds, enough time for her to process the veiled threat, enough time to see the calculation happening behind those eyes that suddenly didn't look so confident. Then I changed the subject with practiced naturalness, like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just put her in her place with surgical precision. You have a beautiful glass. Where's it from? The woman was speechless for 3 full seconds, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process the abrupt change in tone, trying to decide whether to answer about the glass, or address the threat, or just walk away. She chose the third option, murmuring a vague excuse about needing to talk to someone before practically running in the opposite direction. I took a sip of champagne that tasted like nothing and registered that small victory with satisfaction that was completely new. I didn't feel bad. I didn't feel cruel. I just felt like I'd defended myself from an unprovoked attack, that I'd established clear boundaries, and that woman would think twice before trying to diminish someone else just because she could. Dante was on the other side of the ballroom, and even from a distance I felt his gaze on me, that constant vigilance that never completely rested. He was leaning against the wall near Enrico, and I saw when he leaned slightly to say something, saw when Enrico turned his face in my direction with that total attention he reserved for important things. Later, when Enrico told me about the conversation, I found out exactly what Dante had said. She learned from you. Dante had watched the entire interaction, had seen the way I'd handled the situation, and had attributed that skill to Enrico's training. But Enrico had disagreed, and when he told me this, there was pride in his voice that made my chest tighten in a good way. No, he'd responded without taking his eyes off me. She learned from herself. I just showed her what she already had. Adeline finally went to an event with me 2 weeks later, as my official companion because Enrico was traveling, and I'd decided to go anyway instead of staying home. She arrived at the apartment 3 hours early, dressed with that obvious nervousness of someone about to enter unknown and potentially hostile territory. "Are you sure I'm not going to embarrass you?" she asked for the 5th time while adjusting the dress we'd bought specifically for the occasion. Something elegant but not flashy, appropriate but not memorable. I held her hands and looked in her eyes firmly. "Adeline, you're the smartest person I know. You'll be fine." The event started normally, with the usual superficial conversations and the usual fake smiles, and Adeline stayed 2 meters behind me all night, watching with that attention of someone watching a live documentary about predator behavior in natural habitat. I saw her out of the corner of my eye, registering every expression that crossed her face. Every moment her eyes widened at something she witnessed. In the car going back, the silence was heavy with unspoken observations, and I waited for her to process everything before speaking. It took 15 full minutes of silent driving, before she finally turned to me with an expression I couldn't fully decipher. "Nyla." Her voice came out strange, loaded with something between admiration and concern. I responded without looking, pretending to be interested in the city lights passing by the window. "You're a different person." The words came out definitive, without judgment, but with real weight. I turned to really look at her, seeing my best friend study me like she was seeing me for the first time. Good different or bad different? Adeline thought for real time, not just giving an automatic answer to make me feel better, but really considering the question and all its implications. When she finally answered, the word came loaded with absolute sincerity. Impressive different. It wasn't good, and it wasn't bad. It was something in between, something that acknowledged fundamental change without judging whether that change was positive or negative. It was the most honest answer she could give, and I appreciated that more than any comforting lie. Theo exploded in the group chat before we even got home, messages appearing in a cascade while Adeline was probably typing to him on the side. "Adeline, tell me everything," followed by 3 more messages in caps demanding immediate details. Adeline's response came carefully formulated, and I could imagine her choosing each word with precision. She walked into a place full of dangerous people, and the dangerous people got slightly intimidated. The digital silence lasted 5 seconds before Theo responded with characteristic drama. My friend became a book protagonist. I laughed despite myself and typed back, "You two are insane." Theo didn't miss the timing. "And you're dating a Don." Like I could forget that fundamental detail of my life that had become a movie script without my explicit permission. Enrico's apartment was different from mine in every possible way. Spacious where mine was cramped. Silent where mine was noisy with neighbors who lived lives too loudly. Elegant where mine was functional and nothing more. But it had started to feel more like home than the apartment I shared with Theo and Adeline. Had started to feel like a space I occupied with rights instead of as a temporary visitor. It was late at night, those dead hours between midnight and dawn, when the world got quiet and masks could fall without an audience. I was curled up on his couch with a design book I was pretending to read, but really just holding to have something in my hands. Enrico was at the table, surrounded by documents that were probably important and illegal in equal proportions, working with that total concentration he used for everything. The silence between us was comfortable in a way that only existed between people who didn't need to fill space with unnecessary words, who could simply exist in the same environment without pressure to entertain or impress or be anything other than what they were. "You've changed." He said this without taking his eyes off the documents, his voice casual but the observation loaded with weight. I know, I didn't pretend surprise or denial, just accepted the observation as an obvious fact we both knew. "How are you feeling about it?" The question came genuine, and he finally lifted his eyes to really look at me, giving total attention that made my stomach flip. Even after months of receiving that look, I thought for real, not giving an automatic answer but really considering how I felt about all the changes, about who I'd been, and who I was becoming, like someone who finally occupies the space they have the right to occupy. Something passed through his eyes, something that looked like satisfaction mixed with pride, and he dropped the documents completely, giving me complete attention in a way that always made the rest of the world disappear. "When I met you, you apologized for existing in new places." The words came out observational, without judgment, just a statement of fact. I know, I had painful awareness of how I'd been, how I made myself small automatically, how I assumed my presence was an intrusion that needed to be constantly justified. "You don't do that anymore." He tilted his head slightly, studying my face with that intensity. "No." The confirmation came out simple, definitive, and there was pride there I didn't try to hide. He stayed quiet for a long moment, and then said something that made my chest tighten in a way that stole the air from my lungs. "I'm proud of you." The words came out with the simplicity of someone who didn't distribute compliments easily, of someone who measured each word before saying it, of someone who meant absolutely everything they said without exaggeration or falseness. Coming from him, those 4 words weighed more than entire speeches from other people. I didn't know what to do with that for a full second, with that compliment that seemed too big to fit in my chest, that made tears want to form in my eyes, even though I wasn't someone who cried easily. When I finally managed to speak, my voice came out lower than I intended, loaded with emotion I couldn't completely hide. "Don't tell me these things when I can't respond in kind." He smiled then, that rare and genuine smile that transformed his entire face, and that I saw so rarely I saved each occurrence as a precious treasure. "You just did." And I had, I realized. I'd responded exactly the right way, with vulnerability and honesty, and without trying to diminish the compliment or deflect from it with self-deprecation. I'd just received it, and acknowledged it, and let it mean what it meant. That night, lying in his bed that had started to feel like mine too, I thought about all the ways I'd changed in 6 months. The Neela who had served coffee thinking her life was boring would never imagine being there, in that too expensive bed, in that too spacious apartment, loved by a too dangerous man. But I was there, and not just there, I belonged there, had earned that space with blood and tears and transformation that hurt, but was worth every second of pain. Enrico came into the bedroom hours later, when he thought I was already asleep, and sat on the edge of the bed just looking at me with that attention that never rested. I pretended to sleep, because I knew he needed that moment of observation, without being observed, needed that space to process everything I'd become without an audience. And while I pretended to sleep, I felt deep gratitude that he'd seen potential in me before I saw it myself, that he'd given me tools without taking away agency, that he'd let me transform instead of trying to mold me. That, more than anything else, was real love. Chapter 9. I love you, and that's the scariest thing I've ever felt. The message arrived on a Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon, when I was cleaning the espresso machine at the coffee shop and thinking about absolutely nothing important. My phone buzzed in my pocket with that insistence that indicated a message from an unknown number, and when I opened it, the photo that appeared on the screen made my stomach drop. It was me, leaving the coffee shop exactly yesterday, with my bag hanging on my shoulder and looking at my phone while I walked, completely oblivious to who was taking that photo from an angle that made it clear they'd been close, dangerously close, without me noticing. The location was marked with surgical precision, and below the photo, the words that made everything much more real and much more dangerous. "Tell him to back off." I didn't panic. 6 months ago, I would have called Enrico immediately with my voice shaking and hands sweating. But now I'd learned that panic didn't solve problems. It just created more. I took 3 deep breaths, saved the screenshot, and dialed the number I'd memorized for emergencies. Dante answered on the second ring. "Nyla." It wasn't a question. It was immediate recognition from caller ID, and there was something comforting in knowing he always answered fast when I called. I got a threat. Photo of me leaving the coffee shop yesterday with a message. I kept my voice low and controlled, aware of the other employees and customers around who didn't need to hear that conversation. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds before he responded with that efficiency that came from years of dealing with crises. "Send it to me. Stay where you are." 20 minutes. I hung up and sent the screenshot, then went back to work like nothing had happened, because collapsing in the middle of my shift wasn't going to help anyone, and would only create questions I couldn't answer. But my hands trembled slightly when I made coffees, and my mind was far away, processing implications and possibilities and all the ways this could end badly. Enrico arrived in 15 minutes, not 20, and the way he came through the door told me Dante had called immediately, that he'd treated this as the real emergency it was. His eyes found me across the crowded coffee shop, and even from a distance I saw when something darkened in that face, when anger started forming beneath the controlled surface. I asked for a 15-minute break, and we left through the side door, where the car was waiting with the engine running and Dante in the driver's seat with an absolutely lethal expression. I got in the back seat, and Enrico got in behind me, and the silence inside the car was so heavy it felt solid. He took my phone without asking and looked at the photo with that total attention, and I saw when his jaw tensed, when his hands gripped the phone with force that could break it if he didn't have superhuman self-control. When he finally spoke, his voice came out too controlled, too calm, The way it got when he was most dangerous. You should leave. Disappear for a while. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order disguised as a request. And I knew it came from a place of desperate protection, of real fear he'd never admit out loud. I won't. The words came out firm, without hesitation, and I saw when his eyes turned to me with that intensity that always undid me inside. Neela, he began, but I cut him off before he could build a complete argument about why I needed to disappear for my own safety. Enrico, if I run now, they learn it works. I looked at him without looking away, using all the firmness I'd developed in months navigating his world. You taught me that. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds I saw frustration and fear and pride fighting for dominance in the expressions crossing his face. When he opened his eyes again, there was resignation there, recognition that I was right, even though he hated admitting it. You're using my own logic against me. His voice came out lower, almost impressed, despite the situation. I smiled, despite the fear still gnawing at my stomach. I learned from the best. Dante drove in silence, while Enrico made calls with a voice that got colder with each conversation, giving orders I didn't fully understand, but knew would solve this in ways I probably didn't want to know details about. I just looked out the window, processing that I'd just refused protection that could save my life, that I'd chosen to stay even knowing the risks, but I didn't regret it. Running meant giving them power, meant admitting I was a weakness that could be exploited every time they wanted to pressure Enrico. And if I was going to be in that world, if I was going to be by his side for real, I needed to be strength instead of vulnerability. The threat was resolved in less than 48 hours, in ways Enrico didn't detail, and I didn't ask about, because some things were better left in silence. But those 48 hours were tense in ways that made the previous days seem like a relaxing vacation, with Dante or someone from his team always nearby, with Enrico compulsively checking my phone's location, with that constant vigilance that was exhausting but necessary. When it finally ended, when Enrico showed up at the apartment at 2 a.m. with an expression that said it was over, that it was safe now, he found me sleeping on the couch, still in my work clothes. I'd tried to stay awake waiting for news, had fought sleep for hours, but eventually exhaustion had won. I woke up to the sound of the door closing, that soft click that pulled me from sleep with that urgency of someone who'd been waiting for someone to come back. He was standing at the entrance to the living room, just looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read in the dim light, and we stayed like that for too long a moment, just looking at each other across the dark space. How long have you been watching me? I asked with a voice still hoarse from sleep, sitting up on the couch and running my hands through my hair that was probably destroyed. Long enough. His answer came strange, loaded with something I couldn't identify. For what? I got up from the couch, wanting to be closer, wanting to see his face properly to understand what was happening here. He stayed quiet for a time that started to get uncomfortable, and when he finally spoke, the words came out with visible difficulty, like he was unlearning how to hold the things he always kept. To know that I can't imagine this apartment without you in it. My heart raced in a way that made my breathing fail, and I waited because I felt there was more coming, that this was the beginning of something important. That's not how I planned to say it. He ran his hand through his hair with rare frustration, that small loss of control that showed how much this was costing. I took 2 steps toward him, getting close enough to see his eyes in the dim light, close enough to feel the heat emanating from his body. How did you plan it? I didn't plan it. That's the problem. The raw honesty of those words made something tighten in my chest in a good way. And then, because I'd spent 6 months learning to be direct, to ask for what I wanted, to say truths without wrapping them in unnecessary protections, I spoke the words that had been growing inside me for a while, but that I'd never had the courage to say out loud. I love you, Enrico. Direct, without beating around the bush, without drama. I learned from you that saying little and saying it right is better than beating around the bush. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have an immediate answer. He just stood there looking at me with that intensity that always undid me, and I saw when something softened in his eyes, when the vulnerability he always hid started to appear on the surface. Me too. The words came out simple, heavy, real in a way that made everything seem more solid. Pause. For longer than it would be reasonable to admit, I smiled, despite the tears that threatened to form, despite the emotion that closed my throat and made breathing seem like a complicated task. He pulled me into a hug that was more about the need for physical contact to confirm we were there, together, safe, than about performative romance. We stayed like that for a long time, just existing in the same space, breathing at the same rhythm, and that was more intimate than anything we'd shared before. My phone buzzed in my pocket at 3 a.m, and when I checked, the group chat was exploding with messages I didn't even remember sending, but apparently had sent at some point between the declaration and the hug. The message I'd sent simply said, "He said he loves me." The responses were exactly what I expected. Theo with ellipses followed by Adeline in caps. Adeline with "I saw," and Theo coming back with "I can't believe it." Adeline, I knew since the coffee shop. Theo, I knew since the $200 tip. I typed back with one hand because the other was busy holding Enrico. "You two are a problem," Theo responded with unwavering conviction. "We are the most important supporting characters in this story, and you know it. And the truth is, he was right, that Theo and Adeline had been there from the beginning, from the first absurd tip and the first too long look, witnessing every step of this impossible transformation from invisible barista to person who was loved by the most dangerous man in New York." I looked at Enrico and saw when he looked at my phone with that expression that said he knew exactly the kind of conversation happening in the group chat and didn't care one bit about my dramatic friends who treated my life like personal entertainment. That night changed something fundamental between us. That declaration that had been said without planning but with absolute honesty. We were no longer just attracted to each other. We were no longer just interested or fascinated or any other safer word than love. We were just two people who had admitted out loud that they felt the scariest and most real thing at the same time, and who were going to figure out together how that worked in a world that didn't make love easy between people from such different worlds, but we were going to figure it out, together, and that was all that mattered. Chapter 10. 1 year. 1 training. 1 choice.
I want real training in your world. Train me.
The proposal came out of my mouth on a Sunday night, when we were at his apartment with that comfortable quietness that had become routine, when defenses were low enough for difficult conversations to happen, without so much emotional bleeding. Enrico was working on documents that were probably important and definitely illegal, and I was pretending to read a book about color theory I needed for school. "I want to understand your world for real." The words came out more abrupt than I intended, cutting the silence without adequate preparation, not as a protected girlfriend, as someone who belongs to it. He stopped mid-signature, the pen suspended in the air, and raised his eyes to look at me with that total attention that always undid me. He didn't answer immediately, just studied me like he was trying to read the intentions behind the words, trying to understand if this was a temporary impulse or a real decision. "Do you know what you're asking?" The question came careful, without judgment, but loaded with weight, with all the implications that came with that impossible request. I put the book aside and turned to face him completely, because that conversation deserved total attention and couldn't be done halfway. "I'm asking for a year. Real training. Structure, alliances, how decisions work, everything." He put the pen down slowly, a controlled movement that indicated he was processing, calculating, considering all the ways this could end badly. "Why? Because if I'm going to be by your side, I want to be by your side." I looked at him without looking away, using all the firmness I'd developed in months learning to occupy space, not behind. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken considerations, with all the risks he was mentally measuring, with all the reasons why he should say no and protect me from a world that would devour people more prepared than me. But I also saw when something changed in his eyes, when recognition passed through that face, recognition that I was serious, and that denying this would be denying who I'd become. 1 year. He repeated the words like he was testing their weight. Long pause. "After that, you decide if you want to continue or if you want to leave." I nodded because that was fair, was reasonable, was more than I expected to get. 1 year. The training started 2 weeks later, and it was more intense than anything Dante had taught me before. It wasn't about reading people at social events anymore, or understanding invisible hierarchies. It was about real structure, about how decisions were made, about alliances and betrayals, and the delicate balance that kept everything working. In the second month, Enrico took me to my first real meeting as an observer. It wasn't a social event with champagne and fake smiles. It was a business meeting in a closed office with men who made decisions that affected lives and fortunes. I sat in the corner of the room with a notebook I pretended to use for notes, but that was actually empty because I couldn't write anything that could be used against someone later. I spent 2 hours observing in absolute silence, cataloging each person, each interaction, each moment of tension that passed disguised as cordiality. When it ended and we were back in the car, Enrico asked for my analysis without warning, just turned and waited for me to say what I'd seen. I talked for 15 minutes without stopping, detailing each man in the room, who was allied with whom, who had lied about what, who was nervous and trying to hide it. When I finished, Dante looked at Enrico through the rearview mirror, with an expression that bordered on impressed. "She got everything right." Dante confirmed what Enrico probably already knew, point by point. In the 4th month, something happened that neither of them expected. I was in a smaller meeting, still theoretically as an observer, when something didn't add up in a calculation they were discussing. The numbers they were presenting didn't match information I'd seen the previous week in a document Enrico had left on his desk. The question came out before I could filter it, before I could remember that observers didn't speak. "Does that number include the new import contract, or is it based only on existing ones?" The silence that settled in was absolute. All the men in the room turned to look at me with expressions ranging from surprise to something close to offense that I dared to speak. But the question was valid, was on point, and the man presenting the numbers turned red before admitting that no, it didn't include the new contract, and the numbers were wrong. Enrico didn't say anything at the time, just nodded slightly like this was completely normal. But in the car later, he placed his hand on my knee with light pressure and just said, "Good question." And those 2 words were worth more than any elaborate compliment. In the 6th month, Silvana made one last attempt to destabilize me. She showed up at the coffee shop on a Thursday. That day, I insisted on continuing to work, because it kept me connected to who I was underneath all the transformation. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee she probably wasn't going to drink, and when I placed the cup in front of her, she made the invitation that was a poorly disguised trap. "We need to talk. Alone." Her eyes were calculating, measuring my reaction, looking for weakness. I agreed because refusing would be admitting fear, and we met 2 hours later at a different coffee shop, neutral territory where neither of us had an advantage. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and she tried every tactic she had, from veiled threats to tempting offers of information that could help me if I just pulled away slightly from Enrico. I listened to everything in silence, let her finish her complete monologue, and then smiled in that way I'd learned from Enrico, that smile that didn't reach the eyes and promised consequences without needing to enunciate them. "Are we done?" I asked with icy politeness. "Because I have a shift at the coffee shop and you're making me late." I didn't tell Enrico details about what Silvana had said, just that it was resolved, that she wouldn't be a problem anymore. He looked at me for a long moment, searching for signs of lies or dangerous omission, and then nodded and never asked again. He trusted, and that trust was worth more than any protection. In the 8th month, I was at an important meeting when a new ally questioned my presence with that arrogance that came from thinking he had the right to question the Don's choices. "With respect, does she have the experience to be here?" Enrico opened his mouth to respond, and I saw the flash of controlled anger cross his face, but I gently placed my hand on his arm, silently asking him to let me respond. He closed his mouth and nodded imperceptibly. I looked at the man without blinking, using all the presence I'd developed in months, occupying spaces that weren't made for me. I have experience reading people who underestimate others based on appearances, and in this room you're the only one doing that right now. The man turned red, stammered something about not meaning to offend, and never questioned my presence at any meeting again. In the 10th month, Dante called me ma'am for the first time. It was a complete accident. He was talking to someone on the phone about schedules and said ma'am will be present, without even realizing what he'd said. But I noticed, and he noticed I noticed. Our eyes met for a second. Silent recognition that something fundamental had changed, and then we both pretended it hadn't happened. Theo and Adeline followed everything through the group chat, living vicariously through my messages that were increasingly absurd from how surreal they were. Theo sent one night, "My friend is being trained to be a Mafia boss." Adeline responded with that tired wisdom. This started with a $200 tip. Theo came back dramatic as always, the most insane trajectory I've ever followed, and I, because I needed to keep my feet on the ground, typed the truth that kept my sanity. "I still work at the coffee shop on Thursdays." Theo's response came instant. "Why?" I explained with patience I'd already explained 1,000 times. "Because I like it, and because it reminds me who I am." There was a digital pause before Adeline responded with something that sounded surprisingly emotional for her. "Okay. She's still Nyla." Theo agreed with characteristic addition, just intimidating now. The year passed faster than I imagined possible, and when it came to an end, Enrico didn't mention any deadline. Didn't ask if I wanted to continue or leave, just kept including me in everything like it had always been that way. But I knew he was waiting for me to say something, to confirm the choice I'd made without words. I was in his apartment, which had become our apartment without formal discussion about it, when I finally addressed the subject that hung between us. "The year's over." He looked at me over the book he was reading, that total attention he always gave me. "I know." "And?" I provoked lightly, wanting him to ask, wanting to have the complete conversation instead of assuming. "And you're still here." The answer came simple, a statement of obvious fact. I smiled and moved closer, sitting next to him on the couch that knew every curve of my body now. "Because I want to be." He put the book aside and pulled me into a hug that was about confirmation and choice and commitment, without needing elaborate words. We stayed like that for a long time, just existing together, and that was answer enough. The year had transformed me in ways I was still discovering, had given me tools and knowledge and confidence I never imagined having. But more importantly, it had given me real choice, opportunity to decide if that world was where I belonged, and I decided yes. Not because Enrico had convinced me or because I had no other options, but because I genuinely wanted to be there, wanted to build something in that impossible space between a Brooklyn coffee shop and Mafia meetings. This was my life now, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Chapter 11.
I chose this life.
He stopped the car in a place I immediately recognized, even in the darkness, even with months having passed since the last time I'd been there. It was the door of my old building, that one in Brooklyn with creaky stairs and peeling paint, the place where everything had truly begun, where I'd admitted for the first time that I'd never been kissed, and he'd promised to start slow. I frowned, confused about why we were there instead of going back to the apartment like I expected. Why here? Enrico turned off the engine and turned to look at me with that total attention, that intensity that still undid me even after all this time together. Because this is where I understood I was going to get complicated with you. Heavy pause, loaded with memory and meaning, and I never regretted it. My heart raced in that stupid way that happened whenever he said something devastatingly honest, whenever he let vulnerability show underneath all the control. I waited because I felt there was more coming, that this was a prelude to something important. I'm not asking if you want to get married. He said this carefully, choosing each word like it mattered too much to be rushed. I'm asking if you want to build this with me, what I have, what you've become, together, officially. I looked at him trying to process the difference between the two things, trying to understand what he was really asking underneath the careful words. Is there a difference? For me, there is. The answer came firm. Definitive, loaded with absolute conviction. Getting married is ceremony. Building is choice every day. I stayed quiet for the time I needed to really consider what he was offering, what he was asking, what this would mean for my life that had already changed so much. It was unrecognizable. This wasn't a romantic proposal with a knee on the ground and a surprise ring. It was a real conversation between equals about commitment that went beyond signed papers. Yes, the word came out without drama, but with real weight that made everything seem more solid. Pause. But I want to keep being who I am. Something softened in his eyes, something that looked like relief mixed with satisfaction. And when he answered, his voice came out with certainty that left no room for doubt. I would need you to be. The wedding happened 6 weeks later. Small and intimate on purpose, just the people who really mattered instead of a performative spectacle for an audience of hundreds. Theo cried before everyone else. During rehearsal the day before, when he saw me trying on the dress for the first time, and started sobbing that his baby was growing up, even though I was only 3 months younger than him. Adeline had been with a camera since 7 in the morning, filming absolutely everything for posterity, as she declared with absolute seriousness, capturing every moment from me drinking coffee nervously to the final minutes before the ceremony, when I finally let the nervousness appear on the surface. The dress was white and simple, without excessive layers of lace or unnecessary details, elegant in a way that felt right for who I'd become. Enrico was in a dark suit as always, and when our eyes met the moment I walked in, I saw something that could be nervousness cross that always controlled face. Dante was beside him as best man, with a serious expression he maintained throughout the entire ceremony, but when he raised his glass for the toast afterward, I saw the gleam in his eyes that gave away everything the expression tried to hide. Pride, approval, something close to happiness. Seeing the boss find something that seemed impossible for men like him. At the moment of the rings, when Enrico held my hand to put on the ring, I realized my hands weren't trembling like I expected them to tremble, that there was firmness there that was completely new. "You're not shaking," he murmured low enough for only me to hear, an observation that carried something like admiration. I smiled with honesty I only gave to him. "I am." Pause. I just learned not to show it. I saw when pride passed through his eyes, when recognition of that moment happened, of what it represented about how much I'd changed since the first time I'd stood in front of him trembling, because I didn't know how to order coffee right. The first meeting after the wedding was a test I knew would come, a moment that would define whether people were going to see me as a real Donna, or just as the Don's wife who was present by tolerance. I entered the room with Enrico, not behind him like I used to do months ago, and sat beside him at the table instead of in the chair against the wall reserved for observers. The same man who had questioned my experience months ago was there, and I saw when his eyes found me, when he registered where I was sitting, when he did the mental calculation about whether he should say something or not. This time he said nothing, just nodded with respect he hadn't offered before, and I registered that silent victory without celebrating externally. The meeting flowed normally, with decisions being made and alliances being confirmed, and when we finished and were back in the car, Enrico asked the question I knew would come. How was it? I looked out the window watching the city pass by, processing how I'd felt occupying that space officially instead of as a temporary visitor. How it should be. He nodded with silent satisfaction, but after a moment, he asked another question that was deeper, that touched on something fundamental about who I was underneath all the transformation. "Do you miss being invisible?" The question deserved real honesty, so I gave it to him without filters or embellishment. I miss the coffee shop, serving people without needing to calculate anything. Pause while I thought about how to explain, but I wouldn't trade it. Why? He turned slightly slightly to look at me, genuinely curious about the answer. I met his eyes and said the truth it had taken months to fully understand. Because there I was surviving. Heavy pause. Here I'm living. I saw when those words hit him, when their complete meaning settled in, and he took my hand with pressure that communicated everything words couldn't. The group chat exploded that night with messages that started funny and ended emotional in ways none of us expected. Theo opened with a dramatic observation. So my friend who had never been kissed married the Mafia boss, and now she's the boss too. Adeline summarized perfectly. Perfect summary. And I, because I knew exactly how to provoke them, typed the question that would make them both freak out. Are you two going to be godparents of the first kid or not? The digital silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Theo responded with ellipses followed by Adeline in absolute caps. Adeline responded with, I'm already crying, and the two started a debate about who would be the better godparent that quickly devolved into complete baby shower planning for a baby that didn't even exist yet. Lying in bed that night, with Enrico beside me reading documents that never ended, I thought about the entire absurd journey that had brought me here. From invisible barista serving coffee to strangers who didn't know my name, to Donna sitting beside the Dawn in meetings that decided fates and fortunes. He'd said I'd never been kissed. He'd said he'd start slow. Neither of us imagined where that slow would lead. How many transformations I'd go through, how many versions of myself I'd need to let die so new ones could be born. But we'd both agree, years later when we looked back, that it was exactly the right speed. Not too fast that it broke everything, not too slow that we lost momentum, just right. And that, more than anything else, was all that mattered. Hi, this is Lena, and you know that some stories don't end when the video does. If you want to keep the story going with him, his private line is open right now in the pinned comment. But let's be real. A man with his power is extremely busy, and everyone is fighting for his attention. Click the link and send your first message. If the line isn't full yet, you might be lucky enough to get a reply from him right now.